Hello and welcome to Skills in Automation. My name is Ash and this is the beginning of a tutorial series where we learn how to send Outlook emails using Excel VBA. In this session, we will start with the very basics such as how to connect to Outlook and manipulate the various properties of an email template. We will also cover multiple scenarios for attaching files to the email. Finally, we'll create a loop to send emails with attachments to multiple recipients. And since manipulating Outlook through VBA is pretty powerful, I would like to share a few tips to manage any risks, especially if you're just starting out. But before we begin, I would like to mention that there will be more tutorials coming out on sending emails where we deep dive into some other concepts such as error handling, attaching multiple files, and manipulating HTML text inside the email body. In addition, we have YouTube videos for projects based on real-life scenarios such as creating a daily schedule to automatically refresh and send out an Excel report via Outlook. Lastly, we also have brief how-to videos that will cover popular Outlook code snippets that you can access easily. Please do check those out as well. All the code covered in this tutorial will be available on our website skillsandautomation.com. I'll post the links below in the description. Okay, let's start coding. So this is an Excel file for this tutorial. We have two sheets here, data, export, but we will refer to these in the later sections. For now, let's Alt F11 and go to our VB editor. There's no code here. So what we can do first is create a new module, right click, insert, module. Let's create our first sub. To send an email via Outlook and to access the various features of Outlook, we need to create a reference to the Outlook object library. Let's F2 to go to the object browser. In the object browser, under libraries, we can see all the libraries that I currently have access to. Outlook is not among them. To be able to create and send emails, we need to be able to access the Outlook application. We can do that by adding a reference to it. Let's close this. Now let's go to Tools, Preferences. Let's scroll all the way down to Microsoft. And now let's go to Microsoft Outlook. That's right here. My version is 16. Yours might be different, but that's fine. Let's select this. Click OK. The biggest advantage of setting references is that we get access to IntelliSense, which makes it much easier to write code. IntelliSense is basically autocomplete. Let's see an example of that. Let's type application, hit dot. You can now see a variety of options out here. This is basically IntelliSense. This gives us access to all the methods and properties of an object, so we do not have to type code from memory. This is super helpful. Let's delete this out. Okay, so now that we have added a reference to the Outlook object library, we can access the Outlook application. Let's create a new instance of it. Let's dim and set an Outlook application variable. So dim, we'll call it OApp, Outlook application. Let's create the new instance. So let's just set it equals to new Outlook application. Next, let's create a new email object. So dim, we'll call it omail dot, and we'll choose mail item. Let's set it now. To create the email object, we will use the create item method of the Outlook application that we just created right up here. So set omail create item. And what kind of item do we want to create? OL mail item sounds about right. Let's select that. Close bracket. That's our email object. Now we have full access to all its properties and methods. Let's first just display a blank email. So we can type in our email object, omail dot. We can see a variety of options out here. These are all the methods and properties of the email object that we have access to right now. We are going to choose the display method. This should bring up the email for us. Let's run this and see what we get. Great. This is just what we want. It's a blank email template. Let's close this. Now, before we move on, I want to address these 4 lines of code. If you aren't quite clear on how we got to creating the email object, or if you're new to VBA objects, that's fine. You can just treat these code lines as static. Just create the Outlook reference and copy and paste these 4 lines of code into your sub procedure and you're good to go. I want to cover one more thing in this section though. You can always empty these object variables by setting them to nothing before you exit the sub. Let's try that now. We'll set the Outlook application to nothing. And we can set the email object to nothing. This is normally considered as best practice to free up memory space, but it's often not required because Excel will delete these objects from memory when the code goes out of scope, or rather when we exit the sub. So basically, it's not necessary in most cases and I'm not going to use it in the rest of the tutorial. Okay, that was how to create a basic email template. In the next section, let's look at how to fill in the various email properties. Let's create a new module and a new sub. And let's paste in our 4 lines of code for the Outlook declarations. Let's just copy these over. Copy. We can start manipulating the various properties of the email such as the to, subject, body, etc. Since there are multiple properties, we can use the with statement. So with OMail, let's just close the with statement first. First, we fill in the body format and set it to plain text. So dot, choose body format, equals to, we have 4 options here. We'll select the plain format. Outlook has 3 main formats, plain, HTML, and rich text. I mostly always work in HTML format and my default format is also set to HTML. For personal Outlook, we can check our default setting here. Come to Outlook, File, Options, Mail, and you can see right here, my default setting is HTML. Yours probably is HTML too. If it is and you want to use HTML, you do not need to explicitly state HTML as the body format property. However, for this section, we are going to create our email in plain text format. So let's just choose that first. Next, let's bring up the email and fill in some properties. First, we fill in a recipient. So to, we'll just use a project email ID. The CC and BCC, we'll leave those blank for now. Let's type in a subject. We'll call it test email. For the email body, let's type in some text. So this will be our first line in our email body. Let's close the double quotes first. To break to a new line in the email body, we will use VB new line. So and to break to a new line within our VBA code, we'll use the ampersand and the underscore. Let's fill in the text for the second line. Let's break to a new line in the email body again. And break to our next line in the VBA code. And that's the last line. So that's the properties we can fill in for now. Let's send this email. But we won't send it just yet. Let's display the email again and I'll comment out the sent. So comment this out and let's just display this. Okay, let's run this and see what we get. Looks good. We have our to, the subject, our email body, but one thing is missing. We can't see our email signature, which we just saw a while ago. Let's add that as well. So close this email. But before we do that, let's just have a look at where our email signature is saved within the personal Outlook. Bring up Outlook again, go to Files, Options, Mail, and come to Signature. And this is a project email signature with some text and a project logo. And we would like to have this displayed in each of our emails. Let's exit out of this. To be able to see our signature, we need to add the body tag at the end of the body text. So let's copy this and add it to the end of a text with an ampersand and the body tag. Just to be a bit more specific, in order for the email signature to appear, we need to add the body tag and display our email right at the beginning after we set the body format. We have already done this, but it's important to do it in the right sequence as well. Okay, let's run this code and see what we get. Looks much better. However, the signature looks a bit off. We just have the text, but the logo is missing. That's because this email is in plain text format. Let's change this to HTML format to be able to view our logo as well. And for the rest of the tutorial, we will be using HTML format. Let's create a new module and a new sub procedure. Let's paste in the code from the previous section and modify it to HTML format. Let's copy this over. Paste. First, we're going to change the body format to HTML. Choose the first one. Remember that my default setting is HTML, so I really don't need this line of code. Next, we need to modify the body. HTML emails have a separate body property, which is HTML body. Since this is HTML now, we can add line breaks within the HTML code. So let's remove this VB line and add in the HTML line break tags. I'll be doing a separate tutorial on how to manipulate the email body using various HTML commands or tags. Let's replace this last body tag as well. Okay, let's display this. This looks much better now. We can see our logo. So let's close this. Now let's remove this first property and see if it still works. Run it. Exactly the same result, which confirms that you do not need to specify the body format if your default email format is HTML. Let's close this and move on to our next section. Let's come back to our 4 lines of code where we created our first email object. This method of setting a reference to the Outlook application and creating a new instance of the mail item object is called early binding. Mainly, this allows us to access IntelliSense. However, if you send the workbook to someone else to run and they have a different version of Outlook, then this macro won't run. To make our code version independent, we can modify the existing lines of code as follows. Let's comment out the first line and dim the OAP variable as an object instead. Let's comment the next line. Here, we'll create the Outlook application object and assign it to our OAP variable. We'll use the create object function and pass the Outlook application as a string. Let's comment the third line out. We'll dim another object variable for the email object as well. And let's comment out the last line. Now we'll create the new object in pretty much the same way. Use the create item method. We'll just replace the OL mail item with 0, which is basically its underlying value. And that's it. These are our new 4 lines of code. Let's delete these out to just make it look a bit tidy. And to make it truly version independent, we need to remove our reference as well. Go to Tools, References, and remove the reference we had made to the Microsoft Outlook library. Untick this. Okay. This method of creating the email object without using the reference to the Outlook email library is called late binding. One thing to remember here though is that we lose our ability to use IntelliSense, which makes it a bit more difficult to write code. I'll show you what I mean. Let's try and type out this line again. Just delete this out. Type in our mail object, press start, and nothing happened. When we used early binding, we saw a list of options pop out. But now here, we have to write everything from memory. So we need to remember that if we want to just bring up the email template, the right property to use is display. Let's test and see if this works. Pretty much the same result. Close this. This way, to type code from memory will get tiresome really fast. Hence, for the remainder of this tutorial, we'll just use early binding. If you want to eventually convert the code to late binding, the best way is to build the code using early binding. And once you have tested everything is working fine, you can come back to the Outlook declarations up here and change the 4 lines of code. Now, let's have a look at how to attach files to our email. Let's create a new sub. And I'm just going to paste in some code that we're already familiar with. First, we create the email object, and then we fill in the properties. Okay, so we want to attach the current workbook that we're working on as an attachment onto the email. For that, we can go within the with statement, after body, attachments, and use the add method. But add what? We need to fill in the full path of the current workbook. For that, let's create a string variable to hold the file path. Come up here. We'll call it this file path and declare it as a string. Let's assign a value to it. So our current workbook is the active workbook. Dot. And for the full path, we will use the full name property. Let's debug print this to see the value. I'll just put in a breakout here and run the code. We get an error saying that the argument is not optional. So first, let's just stop this code, copy the file path and paste it. I just want to debug print this file path and make sure that it is the correct file path. So let's run this again. Great. We can see the file path out here. That is indeed the correct file path. You can see the entire folder path and the actual file name. So let's stop this. Just come and this debug print out, take out the breakpoint, and let's run this full code. Okay, so we have saved the current file as an attachment. One thing to note here though is that the method will attach the last saved version of the current workbook and won't contain any changes made since. Let's create a new sub procedure. And we'll just copy in the code from the previous section. This time around, we want to save a copy of the current workbook and attach that copy to the email. We can achieve this by using the environ function to access the temporary folder in our Windows C drive and save a copy of a workbook there. So let's come back to our file path variable. This time, we don't want the full file path. We just want the name of a workbook. So we will use the .name property. So we'll delete out the full name and add name instead. So this will just return us the file name of this current workbook. Before it, we will use the environ function and pass the temp folder in it and pass temp as a string. Ampersand, and just put in the backslash, ampersand again. Okay, let's debug print this and see what we get. Put a break here and run the code. Our expectation is to get the exact same file path. And this is my temporary folder. And we have a file name attached in front of it. So it looks good. Let's stop this. Now, since we're saving the file in a physical location, we need to check if another file exists there with the same name. If it does, we will delete it and save our copy. If it doesn't, then we can just go ahead and save our copy directly. Let's write the code for that. Delete this out. So if to check whether the file exists or not, we will use the dir function and pass in the file path. So if this function returns a blank, then this file does not exist. And in that case, we can just go ahead and save a copy of our current workbook in that file path. So active workbook. We want to save a copy. As what? As this file path. But if it does exist, we need to first delete that file. And to delete a file, we'll use a kill command. Now that the file is deleted, we can go ahead and save a copy. So just copy this and paste it below out here. Let's close the if statement. And since this is a temporary copy, which we do not have any use for once the email has been sent, we can just delete it off once the email send procedure completes. So we'll copy this command and paste it after our with statement. So basically, once the file has been sent, we will delete off this file. Okay, that's it. Let's run and see if this works. Our file has been attached, so that seems to be working. Let's close this off. So far, we have looked at how to attach the current workbook. Let's now have a look at how to attach an existing file saved somewhere in a folder location. Let's create a new sub. Let's add the 4 lines of code to connect to Outlook. Next, we can add the email properties. I'll just comment out the attachments.add method for now. Okay, this is pretty easy as it is in line with what we have already done so far. In fact, it's lesser code. Instead of saving our current file in a certain location and attaching it to the email, we now have a separate Excel file already existing in some location. Let's declare and assign a string variable to hold that file path. Let's now assign a file path to this variable. So I'm just going to attach this statement1.csv file. So for that, first we can copy this folder path. Control C. Put a backslash. And then copy the file name. In double quotes. Now this time, we need to check if the file really does exist in that location or not. Someone could have accidentally deleted it or moved it to another location. In that case, the attachments.add method would error out. So let's check if it exists using the dir function. Put in a file path variable. If this function returns a blank value, then the file does not exist. And if it doesn't exist, let's alert the user and exit the sub. So let's do a message box. Just say file doesn't exist and exit the sub. Close the if statement. And for the last part, let's undo this comment and add our file path variable. Let's run and see if this works. Great, we can see a statement CSV file attached out here, and the rest of the email looks fine as well. Let's close this. Attaching a file is the same code regardless of the file type. So if it's a PDF, we can add the folder location and add in the file name with the right file extension. Let's try and attach a PDF file now. I've saved a few PDF invoices out here. So let's copy this file path first. Delete out our previous file path. add in a backslash. And we'll just add in one PDF for now. Let's run this and see what we get. Great. Now we have a PDF attachment. Before we move on to the next section, I want to quickly show how to add multiple files. We just need to repeat the attachments.add method again. Let's do that. Let's declare two variables now. So I'm just going to change this to 1 and add in a second variable. We'll assign a file path to the new variable as well. Change this to 1, change this to 2. And for the second variable, we'll add this particular PDF. Right, now let's come to our attachments.add method. Change this to 1. So out here, for the first attachments.add, we'll add in this particular PDF. And now if we want to add the second variable or the second PDF, we need to run the attachment.add method once again. So copy this, paste it on a new line, change this to 2. Let's run this and see what we get. Looks like we need to change this function as well. Let's click OK. Stop the code. I'll just add in an OR condition. Copy this. We can alter the message as well. So what this will do is if either of these PDF files does not exist, we will create a message to alert the user and exit out of the sub. Okay, hopefully this should work. Let's run this. Great. Now we have two PDF attachments. You could do this for multiple attachments, but hard coding the file paths this way is not the best way to code. We have a separate tutorial dedicated to attaching multiple files in context of a real life scenario. Please do check that out as well. Okay, let's move on to the next section. So far, we have looked at how to attach full Excel workbooks or files. But what if you just want to attach an existing worksheet from a current workbook? Let's have a look at how to execute that code as well. Let's do the usual drill. Let's copy over the declarations and properties from our previous code and paste it into a new sub. Let's delete the lines that we don't need. Okay, let's have a look at our export sheet. It's got data related to invoices. We are going to save this worksheet as a separate Excel file in a temporary location. Before we proceed with how to save the worksheet, let's dim and assign the file path for the temp folder. We've covered how to do this already. Dim the new file path variable as a string. We'll first use the environ function and pass the temp folder as a string variable. Add a backslash. And we can assign a name to the file that we want to create. Let's call it data file. We will follow the usual next step. If a file exists with the same file name, we'll just delete it off. And since we won't need this file after sending the email, let's write a command to delete the file once the email has been sent. So copy this kill statement and paste it after the close of the with statement. Okay, now for the part where we need to save our worksheet. we will save it as a new Excel file. Let's create the file first. We'll assign a variable as an Excel workbook. And we'll create the new workbook using the workbooks.add method. We can copy over our export worksheet as the entire worksheet. That is, we don't need to copy the contents by pasting them into a range. We could do that as well, but copying the worksheet directly copies over the formatting as well, and we can do it in one line using the worksheet copy method. Just a quick sideline, we can reference the worksheet directly using the worksheet code name. So here's the worksheet code name, and that's what we're going to use. Dot, and we'll choose copy. Let's hit F1 to see what options we have available for this method. We have two options here to place our current worksheet in the destination workbook. So we can choose before or after a particular worksheet in the destination file. Since we are saving it in a new Excel file, the file has only one default blank worksheet called sheet 1. We can choose either before or after in this instance. So I'm going to go with after and choose which worksheet. We could either type in 1, which is the value of the first worksheet, or we can directly say sheet 1. Let's just step through this and see how it looks. I'm just going to place a few breakpoints. Let's run this code. So this should create a new workbook. And this is a blank workbook, and you can see the default sheet name is sheet 1. That line of code would have copied over our export worksheet to the new workbook and place it after sheet 1. Great. Looks like it's working so far. You could delete off sheet 1 if you want, but I'm going to leave it in. Let's stop this. Great. So far, we have created a new file, copied an entire worksheet from our current Excel file to the new file. Now, let's save the changes we have made and close the new file. Since this is a brand new file, we need to save as. We can choose save copy as. And what do we want to save it as? We want to save it as the new file path. Now we can close off this file. That's it. Just make sure that the attachments.add method points to the right file path. So it's pointing to new file path, which is correct. Let's run this and see what we get. Great. We can see an attachment here called data file, which is exactly the file path we wanted to save the new file as. Okay, so we have a copy of our export worksheet. This looks like it's worked fine. We can close all this off and move to the next section. So far, we have been hard coding our email properties into our sub. These are our to, subject, email body, etc. Ideally, we would be deriving these values from somewhere. In this section, let's try and extract some of those properties from our worksheet and add it to the email. Let's create a new sub in a new module. Let's first paste in our 4 lines of Outlook code. And let's fill in some blank properties. Now, let's have a look at the worksheet where we're going to read the data from. We have an email ID, name of a contact, the company name, and the name of the statement file. We also have a file path here for where the statements are currently saved. So we have 3 lines of data out here, but for this section, we're just going to use the first line. We will be looping through this data in a couple of sections from now. Okay, let's go back to our VB editor. Let's first dim and assign a string variable to hold the main folder path. So that's this path. We'll call it attach path. And we will assign it to read directly from the Excel file where it is currently stored in. So it's currently stored in cell H1. So first, let's reference our worksheet. We're using our worksheet code name directly out here. We'll use the range property. And we know we want to use cell H1. We could leave it as this, or we could say dot value, and we want to put a backslash at the end of it. Now let's dim some string variables to hold our email properties. So our sender to, we'll add in a variable to hold the first name of our contact. A variable for our email body. And a variable for our attachment. So let's start with email ID, which is in cell A2. The first name is in cell B2. Now we're not going to add the name as an email property because there's no property for that, but instead let's add it to our email text. It would be a nice customization that gives a personal touch. So we'll say hi, close the double quotes, ampersand, and add in our first name variable out here. Put in the comma and 2 line breaks. And let's jump to the next line. So what this line is basically going to look like is, it'll say hi and Ash, which is the first name out here. So that's how our first line of our email body is going to look like. Now let's fill in the rest of our email body. Lastly, let's get the file name of our attachment. The file name is stored in cell D2. But this will just give us a file name. To use it in the attachments.add method, we need to provide the full file path. For that, let's modify this variable. We will add a folder path and join it to our file name. Good practice would be to check if this file exists or not, but I will leave that to you to add. We have covered this in our previous sections. Now let's fill in our email properties. First, the to. We'll just hard code in our subject. Add our email body variable. And add the HTML body tag once again so that our signature shows up. And finally, add our attachment variable. Okay, let's run this and see if it works. Great. I can't see our signature, but let's have a look at our other properties. So we have a to, we have a subject, the statement file is attached, which is good. And I think we need a space between the hi and the person's name. So we need to go back to our code and add these two things, which is a space here and our signature. Let's do that now. So for the space, that should be easy. Come to hi and add a space out here. And for our signature to appear, we need to remember two things. One is add the HTML body tag after the email body text. And the second is to display our email before we start filling in our properties. Okay, hopefully that should work. Great, that looks much better. We have a space out here and our signature is appearing. Everything seems to have worked well. Now let's move on to our next section. So far, we've included the 4 lines of outload declarations and the email properties within the main sub. But to make our code neater and easier to read, it would be more efficient to put the Outlook part in a separate sub-procedure and call that sub-procedure from our main sub-procedure. So let's have a look at how to do that. Let's create a new sub-procedure. What we're going to do is create a basic send email macro, which we have already covered. And once we do that, we will separate out the Outlook part. Let's first add in the code that we're already familiar with. We can read our email ID and first name from a worksheet just like we did in the previous section. So we'll create two string variables, one to hold our send to and the second to hold the first name. Let's read these both from the worksheet. So we're reading to from cell A2 and first name from cell B2. We can create a variable to hold the email body as well and add the first name within the email body. Now let's fill out our email properties. I'm just going to remove this attachment line that we had from the previous code. We don't want to attach anything in this particular section. Okay, so far this was pretty much a repeat of what we had done in the previous section, but let's just test and see whether this works. Okay, our email is getting populated. That's good. Now let's create a new private sub. We'll just call it send email. We're creating a private sub procedure because we do not want to reference this particular sub procedure beyond this module. Now we can pass the to and first name variables as arguments into this private sub procedure. Let's do that. Okay, first let's cut and paste these 4 lines of Outlook declaration. Cut this and paste it into our new sub. Next, let's cut and paste the email property assignments. So cut this, paste it here. But we are not passing the body as a parameter in our new private sub. Rather, we can declare and assign it in the new sub itself. So let's cut and paste this below. We'll just change this variable name slightly. And now we need to change this first name variable as well to reflect the first name variable that is being passed as a parameter inside our private sub. So let's copy this and replace this variable. Let's update the email property as well to reflect the new body variable. Finally, the to variable needs to match this parameter variable as well. Copy this and paste it here. Okay, that's it for our private sub. Now let's go back to our main sub procedure and call it from there. So to call the email sub procedure, we just need to use the call command and the sub procedure name. Now we don't really need to type in call. However, it does make it easier to understand this line of code. But we aren't done yet. We still need to pass in our 2 arguments. Let's do that. So the first argument will be our to variable. Copy this, paste it here. And the next one is our first name. Copy that and paste it here as well. And that's it. Let's run this and see if it works. Great. Everything seems to have worked fine. And a private sub has successfully taken the parameters that we passed from our main sub procedure. Now let's move on to our final coding section. This is the last scenario that we are going to look at in this video. Let's go to our data sheet. We can see 3 lines of data here. What we're going to do is loop through each line of data and send an email to each customer. It will combine a lot of what we have already learned. Plus, we will learn how to loop over the data as well. We are going to separate out the send Outlook email code into a separate sub, just like we did in the previous section. So let's first start with that code. This time, we will pass the email ID, first name, and attachment as parameters. And let's copy over the same code that we had done in the previous section. The only thing that's missing is the attachment.add method. So let's add that now. And we'll add in our attachment variable that we'll be passing as a parameter. Now let's create the main sub. Usually I would have started out with the main sub first, but I felt the previous section would still be fresh in memory, so better to finish off the send email part first. Okay, let's create a new sub procedure. We're going to send a total of 3 emails, so our screen is going to flutter a bit. We can avoid this by setting the screen updating to false. And turn it back to true at the end of the sub. Let's create a variable to hold the main folder path, which is in cell H1. Now to loop through the data, we need to determine the last row of this data. We can see that it's row 4, but in a real life scenario, the size of the data will keep changing and hence we need a variable to determine the last data row. Let's first define a long variable to hold the last row number. To find the last row, one of the methods we can use is the rows.count property of the current region. Let's head over to our data. You can click anywhere inside this data range and click Ctrl+Shift+8. This is the current region of our data and gives us access to some handy properties. So let's first access the current region of the first cell in our data, which is range A1. Dot current region. And then use the rows collection to access the count property, which will give us the total number of rows in that data range. So dot rows dot count. Let's run through this and see if we get the right value. Let's hover over the variable. We can see that the value it's taking is 4, which is the right number of rows. Stop. Next, let's start the procedure to loop through our data. Before we do that though, let's declare the variables that we will need inside the loop. These are our 2 first name and attachment variables. We will also need a variable to iterate or step through our range. Okay, let's open the loop now. We will use the for statement. Since our data starts from the second row, we will say from 2 to the last row, which is basically the variable L row. Let's close this loop first. Now let's start assigning our variables within the loop. Our email ID is in column A and it will be in row I. So I is our iteration variable. For the first data row, I will have the value of 2. For the next, it will have 3. And for the last one, it will have 4. We can do the same thing for the first name and the attachment variable. But this attachment variable will just contain the file name. We need to add the attachment folder as well to it. Great. Those are all our variables. Now let's call this private sub procedure. So call and fill in our parameters. And that's pretty much all we need. Let's run this and see if it works. Actually, I just realized that we haven't actually sent an email so far in our entire tutorial. We have been replacing the send method with display. So for this last code, what we can do is cancel out the display and replace it with send. So the expectation is that once we run this code, we will receive 3 emails for each line of data. Let's run this. We wanted our emails to be sent, not displayed. So looks like something has gone wrong out here. Okay. Looks like there is an error with attaching the file. The VBA file path seems incorrect. Okay, let's see what the issue is. So the attachment file name is being read directly from the cell in column D. Let's have a look at column D. Statement 1, statement 2, statement 3.csv, and that's a file name. So that part is correct. Is there an issue with the attachment path? Okay, so that's where the error is. We haven't added a backslash at the end of the file path, and that's what we should do now. Okay, I'm guessing that was the only error. Let's run this again and see if it works. Okay, we can see emails are being sent. Seems like the application screen updating didn't do really much, which is fine. I think that's because we try to display the email out here. But let's go to Outlook email and come to our send items. Yes, 3 emails have been sent out. Come to our inbox. Okay, looks like we're receiving the emails, and we received 3 emails. Let's have a look at each one. The first one is hi Ash, and we're getting statement 1. So our dynamic text is working fine, and we're attaching the attachment that is related to the first data line. Let's go to the second email. So it's hi Bo, and statement 3. Let's just verify this. Bo and statement 3. Great. And so the final should be Rick and statement 2. Awesome. So looks like a loop ran fine, and we successfully passed in 3 parameters into a separate send email subprocedure. Okay, so that's it for the coding part. Let's move on to the next section, which has a few handy tips. Now we are done with the coding for this video, but before we end, I think it's necessary to pause and talk about a few risks to be mindful of. VBA is a powerful way to automate sending of emails, and it can open up a whole new level of practical automation for your work scenario. We can manipulate and customize emails almost any way we want. We can loop through code to send emails to multiple recipients based on some logic. And here comes the caution. If there is any fault in the logic of the code, you could end up sending emails to the wrong person with the wrong attachment. This could be disastrous in scenarios such as emailing invoices to your customer. VBA will just quickly power through the code, and it would be too late to stop the code after you realize that a mistake has been made. Hence, it's very, very important to be extremely cautious. I've made mistakes early on and would like to share a few tips that I use personally. No matter how many projects I've built, I am still super paranoid when it comes to sending emails through VBA. When building the code, always comment out the .send method. Keep the .display property displayed instead. This is to prevent us from accidentally triggering the code when we are not yet ready. Even when you're ready to test and send emails, step through your code using F8 and place multiple breakpoints, especially when using loops. If possible, proof your data before and not when you're assigning values or variables to the email properties. Now, this tip is a personal preference, and it may lead to double handling of data, but sometimes that's okay. I like to keep the code for assigning of email properties as clean as possible. So I, myself, would not have any if-thens as shown in this example. Rather, I would just create a string variable and assign it to the output of the logic, and then assign the variable to the .to property. I would also check whether the variable matches certain conditions before starting the Outlook code. That way, if there is any error, we can just exit out of the code through our error handling. Continuing on the same point, if you have to send emails to say 50 customers and need to check some logic on them, then usually the most effective way would be to create a loop that checks logic for each customer, sends the email if it's all okay, and then moves on to the next customer. This is considered efficient since we're doing all of this in the same iterative loop. Now I know what I'm about to suggest will be considered double handling, but I would rather prefer to run a loop over the 50 customers, check the logic, make sure everything is correct, and then loop over the 50 customers again, and this time send the emails straight away. That way, if there is any error, I will catch it in the first loop and exit the sub-procedure indicating what went wrong. This will also make me confident that when the Outlook code portion begins, each email will be sent out 100% without any errors. I know I am double handling by creating 2 loops instead of 1. However, For 50 emails and even say 100, 200 emails, the incremental time cost per the second loop would be just a few seconds, and I don't mind spending those extra seconds in exchange for peace of mind. But it's completely up to you. And the last tip is regarding error handling. More the better. For example, check if your email IDs match the right format. Check if the attachment file exists, whether the extensions are correct or not, and add code to gracefully exit the sub procedure if an error occurs, and have some way of communicating what went wrong. Normally, I have a dedicated worksheet that populates all the errors in one go. Worst is to have the code break down on you when you've already sent, say, 45 emails and have another 70 to go. We will cover error handling in the next tutorial. Okay, these tips of caution might seem like a bit much, but I did want to call these out. Creating VBA code that does something and ends with sending Outlook emails is one of my favorite coding scenarios, but it must be approached with a bit of caution. So that was the video. I hope you learned some new stuff that you can take away with you and implement in your workplace. Automating sending of reports is one of the coolest coding scenarios in VBA. Sending emails through code increases your exposure because now you're sending an email to someone and they will know that you have created some form of automation, which in turn will improve recognition. It's also a super time saver, so make sure your manager knows how many hours you've saved. Before I leave, I want to mention once again that we will be posting more tutorials related to Outlook emails. There is also a great project that covers an end-to-end real-life scenario of scheduling a daily report through VBA. So do make sure that you look out for those. And if you feel that this video has added some value, please do consider subscribing. Okay, thanks and see you in the next one.